Hansel and Gretel by Cynthia Rylant. It has been said that guardian spirits watch over and protect small children, and that may be so. But there are also stories of children who find the courage to protect themselves. Such is the story of Hansel and Gretel. Inside a stone cottage in a green forest, a young brother and a young sister, Hansel and Gretel, lived with their father and stepmother. Their real mother had died. The family was very poor, for the father had been ill and unable to work for their bread. They were down to their last loaf. The new wife was very bitter about this. She was expecting to be taken care of, and now here she was, nearly starving. She decided to blame the children. She said to her husband late one night, "We cannot feed ourselves and feed your children at the same time. Because of them we are starving. Your children eat too much anyway. We must be rid of them." The father was very upset. "They mean no harm," he said. "They're but children." "Children or not, they're eating our bread," said the wife. "They have to go." There are many forms of wickedness in the world. Sometimes it is easy to recognize who is evil. Sometimes it is not easy at all. Wickedness can wear a smile just as goodness can. Hansel and Gretel would soon learn this hard lesson. Late the next evening, the children could not sleep. They overheard their stepmother plotting to be rid of them. "We'll take them deep into the forest and leave them there. They will never find their way back home, and what is ours will be ours, husband." The father was a weak man. He had been so sad since the children's mother had died that all his courage was gone. He agreed to do what his selfish wife told him to do, for he had no fight left in him. In her little bed, Gretel began to cry softly. "Oh, brother," she whispered to Hansel, "we're to die." Hansel, however, was not afraid. He possessed the courage his father lacked, and he would do what was necessary to protect his sister. "Don't worry, Gretel," whispered Hansel. "You will not die. Trust me." And when Gretel had finally cried herself to sleep, the house was still. So Hansel crept outside under the light of the moon. He filled his pockets with small white pebbles from a pathway near the door. The next day, the children's father and stepmother dressed the children for a walk. "We'll go together into the forest and find some flowers," the stepmother said with a smile. As they went farther and farther away from the cottage, every so often Hansel bent down as though to look at a leaf. What he was really doing, however, was dropping a small pebble. When they finally reached the deep part of the forest, the father told the stepmother told the children to sit under a tree and wait for them. "We will find you some good berries to eat for your supper," said the stepmother, again with a smile. The children waited all night. By morning, they were still waiting. "It's time to go home," said Hansel. They followed the trail of small white pebbles he had dropped all the way back home. The father was happy to see them. Their mother pretended to be. That night, the children again overheard their stepmother plotting to be rid of them. "Tomorrow we'll take them so deep into the forest they'll never come home again," she said. And again Hansel waited until everyone was asleep so he might gather small white pebbles that would lead them home. But this night the door had been locked, and Hansel could not get out. So he carefully cut away a piece of the last loaf of bread and put it in his pocket. The next day the children were dressed again to go into the forest. "We will look at the birds," said the stepmother with a smile. And they walked deeper and deeper in. Hansel stopped now and then, as though expecting closely some small thing. In fact, he was dropping crumbs of bread from his pocket. The father and stepmother told the children to wait under a tree, promising this time to certainly return with berries. The children waited all night. By morning they were waiting still. "It's time to go home," said Hansel. But a most terrible thing had happened. As the children had slept, the little mice and birds of the forest had eaten every crumb of bread that Hansel had dropped. Gretel began to cry softly. "We'll be all right, Gretel," said Hansel. "Take courage." And they began to walk, hoping to find help. And after some time, and so suffering with hunger, the children came upon a little white house in the forest, surrounded by beautiful flowers. It was so pretty, it looked good enough to eat. In fact, it was good enough to eat. The children discovered that the house was made of cake and sugar, and they set right to nibbling. Hansel pulled off a bit of sugar and put it in his mouth. Gretel tasted the window boxes. And then suddenly, a kind voice called from inside. "Children dear, children fair, I love children everywhere." And the door opened, and there stood an old woman wearing a smile. She welcomed Hansel and Gretel into her home and fed them warm food and put them to bed under a comforter. The children were so very grateful. But once they were asleep, the old woman picked them up and put them in cages behind the house. When Hansel and Gretel awoke in the morning and realized what had happened, they knew that the old woman was actually a witch. Her smile was gone now. The witch liked to eat little children, but she liked them plump and juicy, and Hansel and Gretel were too thin. She would have to fatten them up first. She made Gretel help her with the cooking and left Hansel in his cage. She planned to eat Hansel first. Each day the witch checked on his plumpness. "Let's see how fat you are. Stick out your finger," the witch told Hansel. Hansel was not only a brave child, he was a smart child. He had noticed the witch had poor eyesight. So each day, instead of putting his finger between the bars of the cage, he stuck out a chicken bone he had found. "Too skinny," shouted the witch, and she ordered Gretel to cook more food. This went on for many days, and for many days the witch thought Hansel had not gotten any plumper. Finally she exploded with impatience. "I'll eat him anyway," she screamed at Gretel. "And then I'll eat you." The witch ordered Gretel to build a fire in the great stone oven. Crying, Gretel did as she was told. But as she worked, she remembered what her brother Hansel had always told her. "Take courage, Gretel." Gretel obeyed and made the fire hot and roaring. When the fire was hot enough for roasting, the witch said, "Now crawl in, little girl, see if the oven is ready." The witch was now secretly planning to eat Gretel first, since Gretel herself had plumped up nicely, and once the girl was inside the oven, the witch was going to shut the door. Gretel, however, happened to be as smart as her brother. She looked at the open oven. "I'm not sure I can get in," Gretel said. "I think it's too small for anyone to fit in there." "Don't be a fool," said the witch. "It's big enough. Look, even I can fit in." And the witch thrust her head inside the door to prove it, and in that instant Gretel, strong from all her hard work, pushed with all her might and pushed that witch right into the oven. The little girl slammed the iron door shut. The witch was dead. "We're saved!" Gretel shouted, and she ran to release her brother. They cried happy tears for being alive. And that's not all they did. They filled their pockets with bits of food, and pieces of gold from the witch's treasure box, and they set out again to somehow find their way home. And perhaps this is when guardian spirits do intervene, for when small children have already been so brave, Hansel and Gretel came to a river where a large white swan was waiting there for them. They crossed the river on its back, and when they were on land again, they knew they must be close to home. Running as fast as they could, they called out for their father, who heard them and came running toward them. He picked them up in his arms and held them and cried 1,000 tears for their safe return. The children's stepmother had died from eating a poisonous mushroom, and finally released from her influence, their father, too, had nearly died of shame from having abandoned his children. But now joy and forgiveness were everywhere. The family had enough gold to buy 500 loaves of bread a day. They would never run out of food again. And love would take care of the rest.